They don't walk away because you didn't care enough. They step back because the way you cared became something they struggled to hold inside themselves. And there is a deeper truth underneath this that most people miss. There are a few rare emotional qualities that can actually reach someone with avoidant tendencies, but very few people naturally embody them. If this is landing for you, pause for a moment and ask yourself honestly, are you trying to win this person back, or are you slowly becoming someone who no longer needs to? One of the most powerful of these qualities is calm emotional presence. People often misunderstand it as emotional numbness or shutting your feelings down, but it is neither of those things. It is a steady internal state where emotions are still there, but they are held with balance instead of spilling out as urgency, pressure, or emotional demand. With someone who has avoidant patterns, this kind of energy is uncommon. Most of what they experience in connection is emotionally charged in one way or another. People seeking reassurance, clarity, constant replies, or immediate emotional responses. Even if it is not intentional, that level of emotional intensity can feel heavy to them. It starts to feel like pressure closing in on their space, quietly challenging their sense of independence and control. Calm presence does something completely different. It communicates without chasing or forcing anything. It quietly says, I am here, but I am not here to overwhelm you or consume you. To maintain this kind of presence, inner stability is essential. It means that when they withdraw, you don't run after them to fix the distance. When they go quiet, you don't spiral into panic or overthinking every detail. You stay anchored within yourself. You return to your own emotional center instead of reacting from fear. This does not mean you stop feeling. It means your feelings are no longer in charge of your actions. You are not driven by the need to repair the connection immediately or secure certainty at any cost. That shift might seem small, but it changes everything. Avoidant individuals are extremely sensitive to emotional pressure, even when it is not spoken out loud. They do not only hear words, they read energy, and urgency, even when hidden behind patience or politeness, still feels like danger to them. Calm emotional presence also creates what can be called a mirror effect. When you remain steady, their own inner fluctuations become more noticeable to them. Your lack of emotional reactivity gently reflects their patterns back without confrontation or blame. It gives them space to feel their own emotions without being pushed to explain or defend themselves. In that kind of space, something unfamiliar begins to form, a sense of safety without expectation. They are no longer preparing for emotional demands, arguments, or pressure to respond in a certain way. Instead, they start observing you more closely, trying to understand why being around you feels different from what they are used to. Over time, this steadiness does not force change, but it softens defenses. Not because you convince them, but because you remove the emotional threat they were bracing for. Your calm becomes something like an anchor, not something they are trapped by, but something they recognize as stable, predictable, and non-threatening. And in a world where connection often feels like emotional negotiation, that kind of energy stands out more than words ever could. The second important quality is self-contained independence. This is often misunderstood as distance or emotional detachment, but it is not about pushing someone away or playing a role to trigger their interest. It is a quiet sense of inner wholeness that does not depend on another person to feel stable, valued, or complete. With avoidant patterns, this quality is deeply disarming because it removes the silent expectation they are always preparing for. The moment when closeness turns into demand, or when connection starts to feel like obligation. Most people, without even realizing it, begin to lean emotionally toward the other person. They adjust their mood, their availability, and their sense of self around the connection. That leaning creates pressure, even when it is unspoken, and that pressure is exactly what triggers withdrawal. They naturally begin to ask for more time, more reassurance, more consistent emotional presence. And in many cases, that is not manipulation or intention, it is simply how avoidant patterns operate. But for them internally, this also points toward a future where they may feel emotionally obligated to give more than they believe they can safely maintain. When you carry self-contained independence, that entire cycle gets disrupted. You stay connected, but you are not emotionally dependent. You value their presence, yet you do not lose your sense of self when they are not around. This creates a very different emotional experience for them. There is no silent pressure building underneath the interaction, no invisible expectation forming over time, no emotional tightening that signals you owe me more closeness. Instead, what exists is space, genuine space, a kind of relational openness where they can approach or step back without immediately triggering emotional consequences or corrective reactions from you. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is not becoming cold or unavailable. In fact, your emotional availability remains intact, but it is no longer attached to neediness or validation seeking. You still engage, you still share, but nothing you offer comes with hidden conditions. Your emotional world does not collapse if they are distant, and it does not spike uncontrollably if they are close. Life continues to move through you whether or not they are actively participating in it, and that continuity becomes one of the most powerful signals they receive. It quietly communicates that closeness with you does not equal loss of self, that being connected to you will not slowly turn into something they feel trapped inside, that your presence is not a demand they must constantly manage or eventually escape from. Over time, this changes the emotional assumptions they carry. The expectation of pressure starts to fade because it is never confirmed. And when pressure is absent long enough, something new begins to take its place. Curiosity, not obligation, not resistance, not defense, but a quiet, uncertain curiosity about why this connection feels lighter, safer, and less consuming than the ones they are used to. They start to lean in, not because they are being pulled, but because nothing is pushing them away. Alongside this, non-reactive depth becomes just as essential. This is the ability to feel things deeply without immediately turning those emotions into reactions, demands, explanations, or attempts to control the outcome. It is emotional presence without emotional urgency. Most people confuse depth with intensity of expression. The more they feel, the more they say, the more they chase clarity, resolution, or reassurance. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, that escalation often feels like emotional exposure they are not ready for. It creates internal pressure even when the intention is love. Non-reactive depth removes that pressure while keeping emotional richness intact. It shows in how you can sit with silence without forcing it to be filled, in how you can listen without interrupting their internal process, in how you can understand what is being felt without demanding that it be fully explained in the moment. You are not disconnected, you are simply not rushing the emotional experience into conclusion. This creates a different kind of intensity, not the kind that overwhelms or corners someone emotionally, but the kind that invites reflection. A steadiness that makes space for truth to surface naturally instead of being extracted through pressure. And in that space, something subtle happens. They begin to feel seen in a way that does not invade them. They notice that you are not trying to decode them in real time, not trying to fix or analyze every shift in their behavior. And that absence of intrusion feels unfamiliar, sometimes even unsettling at first, because it does not match what they are used to. They are accustomed to being either misunderstood or emotionally examined too closely, but here they are simply allowed to exist as they are without immediate interpretation. Non-reactive depth also means you do not collapse emotionally based on their fluctuations. Their distance does not pull you into panic. Their closeness does not destabilize you into over-attachment. You remain internally steady, not because you feel less, but because you are no longer letting every emotional wave dictate your direction. And slowly, this combination of qualities changes the entire emotional landscape between you and them. Calm presence removes pressure, self-contained independence removes dependency, non-reactive depth removes emotional overload. What remains is something very rare for them to encounter, a connection that does not demand they protect themselves from it. And in that unfamiliar safety, resistance doesn't need to be forced down. It simply begins to soften on its own. When they move closer, you do not rush forward in a way that overwhelms or corners them. When they step back, you do not fall into visible frustration, anxiety, or attempts to regain control of the connection. Your emotional world stays steady, not because your feelings are absent, but because they are not fragile or easily destabilized by someone else's distance. That steadiness matters more than most people realize. It allows them to experience closeness without feeling like they are suddenly responsible for managing your emotional state or preventing your emotional collapse. Over time, this creates a very different kind of relational space, one where they can approach intimacy at their own rhythm without pressure guiding every step. There is no urgency pulling them inward, no emotional reaction pushing them away, just a consistent presence that can hold complexity without forcing it into immediate resolution. And in that environment, something begins to shift quietly. They start to encounter a type of connection that feels unfamiliar to them, depth that does not confine them, understanding that does not require immediate emotional exposure, a bond that exists without demanding performance, explanation, or constant reassurance. There is not a hidden fourth quality completing this framework. Trying to force one would weaken the clarity of what these three qualities already represent. It would turn something precise into something diluted, something structured into something scattered. But beneath all of them, there is something more foundational, not another trait added to the list, but the source from which they naturally emerge. Inner security. Inner security is the quiet, steady sense that you are not at risk of losing yourself inside connection. Without it, calm presence can become emotional suppression. Self-contained independence can turn into emotional distance. Non-reactive depth can feel like withdrawal or avoidance. With it, those same qualities stop being techniques or behaviors. They become natural expressions of who you are. And people with avoidant patterns often recognize this difference instinctively, even if they cannot put it into words. They can feel when someone is acting from strategy versus when someone is acting from inner stability. Inner security is not built through trying to manage someone else's behavior. It is built in the private moments where you choose yourself without needing it to be seen or validated. When you stop measuring your worth through their consistency, when you stop interpreting their distance as a reflection of your value, when you no longer adjust your emotional expression just to hold on to their presence. It is subtle, but it changes the entire emotional tone of how you show up. Because now, there is no hidden tension underneath your actions, no quiet fear shaping your responses, no unspoken urgency trying to secure what feels uncertain. You are not holding back to keep them close. You are not overextending yourself to earn stability. You are simply grounded in yourself. And that center does not shift depending on how they behave. What they begin to experience in that space is something rare for them. Connection without pressure, presence without dependency, depth without emotional demand. They may not consciously identify it as inner security, but they feel its effects immediately. It registers as something stable, something non-intrusive, something that does not threaten their autonomy. And that feeling is what makes the three qualities work together without contradiction. Because at that point, they are no longer strategies being applied to influence someone else. They are natural expressions of a person who is already internally whole. There is no fifth quality waiting beyond this point, because once you move past the core elements, you are no longer talking about what attracts someone with avoidant patterns. You are entering the territory of what simply supports healthy human connection in general. And that distinction matters, because the moment you start adding more and more traits, the entire idea shifts. What was once natural begins to feel calculated. What was once grounded begins to sound like a formula for influence rather than a lived emotional state. What you might actually be reaching for here is not another trait, but a deeper level of awareness that shapes how all of this is expressed in real life. That layer is discernment. Discernment is the ability to see things clearly without being emotionally swept into them. It allows you to observe connection without immediately becoming entangled in hope, fear, or interpretation. It helps you recognize differences that are often blurred in emotionally charged situations, such as whether someone is avoidant in their attachment style or simply not interested in building something with you. Whether their distance comes from fear and internal conflict or from a lack of real investment altogether. Without discernment, people often stay longer than they should. They confuse patience with progress. They assume that if they just understand enough, give enough, or wait long enough, the connection will eventually transform into something stable. Discernment interrupts that assumption. It brings a quieter question into focus. Is there mutual effort here, even if it looks different on the surface? With avoidant patterns in particular, discernment becomes essential. It protects you from overinterpreting inconsistency as complexity or emotional unavailability as depth. It stops you from romanticizing distance or turning confusion into meaning. Instead of rushing to justify what is happening, you begin to observe it for what it is. Not to judge it, but to understand it clearly. You allow space, but you also stay aware of what is actually being offered back to you. Not in theory, not in potential, but in reality. And that awareness changes your internal position. You are no longer trying to fix the dynamic or prove that you are worth consistency. You are no longer positioning yourself as the exception to someone's emotional pattern. You begin to evaluate moment by moment whether their pattern actually fits into your life in a healthy way. This shift is subtle, but it restores balance, because the center of the connection is no longer about reaching them or decoding them. It becomes about whether meeting them where they are still honors who you are. And as this awareness deepens, something else becomes clear. By the time you search for a sixth quality, you are no longer seeking understanding, you are seeking certainty. And certainty is exactly what this kind of dynamic does not naturally provide. The more you try to add layers, the more you move away from lived experience and toward construction. It stops feeling like something you are in and starts feeling like something you are trying to solve. What sits underneath that urge is not another trait, but a shift in orientation altogether. Detachment from outcome. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is not pretending not to care. It is the ability to stay fully present in a connection without tying your emotional stability to where it ends up or how it unfolds. Especially in dynamics involving avoidant patterns, this becomes profoundly important because it removes the silent pressure that often builds underneath attachment. The pressure of needing it to become something, the pressure of needing it to be consistent, the pressure of needing it to resolve in a certain way. When that pressure is no longer driving your behavior, the entire emotional tone changes. You are no longer chasing certainty through closeness. You are no longer shaping yourself around an outcome you cannot control. Instead, you are present, aware, and steady, without turning the connection into something you must secure in order to feel okay. And in that state, what remains is much simpler and much more real. Most people, even when they appear calm on the surface, are internally tracking everything. They are watching for progress, scanning for signals, waiting for reassurance, and constantly measuring whether things are becoming closer or more secure. That quiet internal monitoring creates tension, even if nothing is said out loud. And tension is something that people with avoidant patterns tend to sense immediately, even if they cannot explain why. When you are detached from outcome, that tension begins to dissolve. You are present, but you are not waiting. You are open, but you are not leaning toward a specific result or trying to pull the connection in a particular direction. This shifts the emotional environment completely. The interaction is no longer oriented around reaching a destination that must be achieved. It becomes something that is simply unfolding in real time, without pressure to become anything more than what it currently is. And in that kind of unfolding, something important appears: space. Space for them to move closer without feeling like every step forward creates obligation. Space for them to engage without sensing that they are being gradually locked into something irreversible. At the same time, this protects you as well. You are no longer over-investing in potential or building emotional energy around a version of the connection that does not exist yet. You respond to what is actually happening, not what you hope will happen someday. That difference keeps you grounded even when their behavior shifts or becomes inconsistent. You are no longer pulled into emotional cycles of anticipation and disappointment because your stability is not depending on their consistency. It remains anchored within you, not within their responses. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this kind of environment feels unfamiliar in a subtle but noticeable way. There is no pressure to become more than they are ready to be, no unspoken expectations sitting underneath the interaction. And without that pressure, the instinct to retreat or protect themselves begins to soften. Not because they have suddenly changed, but because the emotional field no longer feels like something they need to escape from. At this point, trying to add another layer or another quality does not actually deepen the understanding. It starts to repeat the same truth in different forms, as if more explanation could somehow make it more complete. But what is forming here is not a checklist. It is a pattern of awareness. And at the center of that awareness is something much simpler than additional traits: self-respect. Self-respect is not loud. It does not rely on ultimatums, control, or rigid rules meant to manage someone else's behavior. It exists in quieter decisions, in what you allow, what you overlook, and what you continue to invest in when the return is unclear. With avoidant patterns, this becomes especially important because inconsistency can slowly reshape your standards if you are not aware of it. You start by being patient, then understanding, then accommodating. And over time, without noticing, you can end up accepting dynamics that no longer match your original sense of emotional balance. When self-respect is present, that gradual erosion does not take hold. You can hold space for someone's emotional patterns without abandoning your own needs in the process. You can understand their distance without turning it into an excuse for imbalance. And because of that, your boundaries do not need to be constantly stated or enforced through reaction. They are expressed through consistency in how you behave. You do not chase when they withdraw, but you also do not overextend when they return. Your energy stays measured, steady, and aligned with reality instead of expectation. And that changes how you are experienced. You are no longer someone who reshapes themselves endlessly just to maintain connection. There is a quiet firmness in how you show up, a sense that you're open but not accessible at any price. And that difference speaks louder than anything you could try to explain. Because people with avoidant patterns are often used to two extremes, either someone who needs too much or someone who gives up too much of themselves just to keep the connection alive. Very little exists in between. With self-respect, you stop occupying either role. You remain emotionally present, but you do not stretch beyond your own limits to maintain proximity. You stay engaged, but you do not abandon your inner balance in order to keep someone close. And in that steadiness, something subtle begins to change. Not necessarily within them directly, but within the structure of the connection itself. The dynamic is no longer centered around their distance, their withdrawal, or their inconsistency. It slowly starts to reflect your internal standard instead. And once that standard is genuinely felt, it is not something easily dismissed or ignored. It introduces a new kind of reference point in the relationship that did not exist before. At this stage, adding more layers or additional qualities no longer strengthens the message. It starts to dilute it, because what you are approaching now is not another trait, but the principle that determines whether all the previous ones remain real over time. Acceptance of reality. Acceptance of reality is the ability to see things exactly as they are, without reshaping them into something easier to emotionally carry. With avoidant patterns, this becomes especially challenging because inconsistency naturally invites interpretation. The mind begins to fill in gaps, searching for hidden meaning, collecting small moments of closeness as proof that something more stable must exist underneath. But acceptance interrupts that process. It brings you back to what is actually being shown in behavior, not what could be happening beneath it, not what once existed, and not what you hope will eventually emerge. This does not make you emotionally distant. It makes you precise in your perception. You begin to recognize patterns without turning them into potential. You see distance for what it is, without automatically reframing it as a temporary phase you just need to endure or outlast. And over time, this prevents a very subtle form of self-abandonment, the kind that happens when you repeatedly reinterpret inconsistency in a way that protects hope but weakens clarity. With acceptance, your internal state becomes more stable. You are no longer reacting strongly to every shift because nothing is unfamiliar anymore. The pattern is understood, not emotionally rewritten each time it appears. Your responses become rooted in awareness instead of anticipation, in clarity instead of confusion, in observation instead of emotional speculation. This does not close you off, it simply keeps you anchored in what is actually taking place between you and the other person without distortion. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this creates a very quiet but noticeable shift. There is no longer the sense that they are being idealized, overinterpreted, or emotionally reshaped into something they are not offering. You are not trying to turn them into a more consistent or more available version of themselves. And in the absence of that projection, the emotional field becomes lighter and more honest. Not because the other person has fundamentally changed, but because you are no longer altering reality in order to make the connection feel more secure than it actually is.